The dining room smelled like jasmine rice and expensive perfume that didn't belong there. Vivian stood at the head of the table, my table, the one my husband Min had sanded smooth with his own hands 30 years ago, and she looked at me the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they've already decided to donate. Grandma Hazel. She always said it like that. 2 words, flat, with a little exhale after, as if my name itself was a small inconvenience. We love you, we do. But you have to understand you're an old woman who smells like incense and doesn't understand how money works anymore. The trust fund is ours to manage now. You signed the papers yourself. A pause. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. Or did you forget that, too? Thomas sat at her left. My son. 41 years old. The boy I had walked to school every morning for 6 years holding his small hand in mine. He looked at his plate. Diana, Vivian's younger sister, the one who called herself a financial consultant, though I had never seen a certificate on her wall, sat across from him, cutting her food into very small pieces, not looking up. The grandchildren were in the other room watching television. I was glad for that. Everyone else at the table, Vivian's cousin, her colleague from the event company, old Mrs. Pham from next door, who had come to drop off a papaya and stayed for dinner, they all went quiet, waiting to see what the old woman would do, waiting for tears, maybe. Or the shaking voice, or the confused look that Vivian always seemed to hope for. I picked up my chopsticks. I smiled just one side, just slightly the way I had smiled at difficult students for 30 years when they thought they had said something clever, and I said nothing. Vivian blinked. She had prepared for a response. I could see it in the way her chin lifted. Ready to interrupt, ready to explain again slowly as though I were a child. My silence confused her. It always did. People who rely on noise to win arguments never know what to do with a woman who simply sets down her chopsticks, folds her hands, and looks at them with clear, patient eyes. Well, she said, and smoothed her napkin. Good. I'm glad we understand each other. I nodded once. We did not understand each other at all. I have been a teacher for 31 years. Middle school English, then high school literature, at the same school in the same city where I was born and where I raised my sons. I retired at 63, not because I had to, but because Min was sick and I wanted to be home. I wanted to make his tea in the morning and sit with him on the balcony in the late afternoon light and not think about lesson plans. He died on a Tuesday in March, 4 years ago now. The magnolia outside our window was just beginning to open. I remember that detail the way I remember everything precisely, without drama, filed away like a page in a gradebook I will never throw out. We had built something careful together, Min and I. A house, a life, 2 sons, and one document, drawn up by attorney Raymond Holt 15 years ago, that Min had been very deliberate about. A trust. For the grandchildren, he had said, folding the papers himself and placing them in the old rosewood box he kept beneath his side of the altar. Not for Thomas, not for any daughter-in-law. For the grandchildren, when they are old enough, when they need it most. He had made me promise to keep that box. I had kept that promise. Vivian came into our lives 7 years ago, which means she came in the year Thomas stopped calling on Sundays. He didn't stop all at once. That is never how it happens. First, the calls got shorter. Then the visits came with conditions: we can only stay 2 nights, we have plans, and then there was always something. Always Vivian's work event, or Vivian's sister's birthday, or Vivian's opinion on what Thomas should and should not discuss with his mother. I watched. I said very little. I had spent 3 decades teaching young people to read carefully, not just words, but silences, the spaces between sentences, what a story omits. I knew how to wait. The first time I heard the phrase, "the trust is being restructured," it was Thomas who said it, almost casually, standing in my kitchen 2 years ago while I was making tea. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the window. I asked him what he meant. He said Vivian and Diana had spoken with a financial advisor, that the money would grow better in a different kind of account, that everything was properly handled. I set his tea in front of him. I did not ask again. But that evening, after he left, I went to the rosewood box beneath the altar. I lifted the lid. The original documents were still there, exactly where Min had placed them, rubber-banded in a brown envelope with his handwriting on the outside. For the children. Do not move. I held the envelope for a long time. The incense had burned low. The photograph of Min on the altar was the one from the year we got married, when he was 26 and laughing at something just outside the frame. I looked at his face. I thought about what he used to say to me when I was anxious about something, a parent meeting that would be difficult, a student who was struggling, a colleague who made things hard. He would put his hand over mine and say it quietly, the way old wisdom is always said quietly. Still water runs deepest, Hazel. Let them think the river is calm. I put the envelope back in the box. I locked it, and I began to pay attention in a different way. My husband was not a man who said much. That was the first thing I noticed about him. The winter I was 24 and he was 26, and we were introduced at his cousin's engagement dinner by a woman who thought we would have nothing in common. She was right and wrong at the same time. We didn't talk much that evening. But we sat near each other for 3 hours, and neither of us moved away, and at the end of the night he walked me to the gate and said, simply, that he hoped to see me again. That was Min, everything deliberate, nothing wasted. He was a civil engineer for the city for 34 years. He designed drainage systems, water infrastructure, the kind of work nobody thinks about until it stops working. He used to joke that his job was to solve problems that no one would ever know existed. I told him that sounded lonely. He said it sounded like peace. We married in the spring, in my mother's house, with a small ceremony and a meal that my aunt spent 2 days preparing. The photographs from that day are on the altar now, framed in dark lacquered wood. Min in his white shirt, laughing at something just out of frame. Me in a pale green dye my mother had made herself, looking directly at the camera the way I always looked at things, straight on, not blinking. We moved into this house the year Thomas was born. It was smaller then. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a balcony that looked out onto the alley and the neighbor's rooftop garden. Min spent the first 5 years slowly expanding it, adding a room when Kevin came, widening the staircase when my mother's knees got bad and she came to stay with us for a while, rebuilding the back wall when the rains got bad one year and the plaster crumbled. He did most of it himself, on weekends, with 1 or 2 friends who came to help and stayed for dinner. The dining table was one of those projects. He bought the wood from a carpenter near the market, rough-cut teak, and spent 3 weekends sanding and fitting and finishing it. I remember standing in the doorway watching him work, the sawdust pale on his forearms, and thinking that this was what it looked like when a person meant to stay somewhere. The altar came later. His mother died first, then mine. Within the same year, 2 losses so close together that grief became a kind of weather we simply lived in for a while. Min built the altar shelf himself, the way he built everything. Carefully, with good wood, making sure the proportions were right. He placed it against the eastern wall of the main room, the way it should be, and he set photographs and incense holders and 2 small cups for tea with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else. Every morning before he left for work, he lit 1 stick of incense. Every evening when he came home, he would stand there quietly for a moment before coming to the kitchen. It was not a dramatic ritual. He didn't pray out loud or bow elaborately. He just stood. I used to think he was reporting and letting his mother know he was still trying his best. I do the same thing now. I taught for 31 years, as I said, but what I haven't said is that I taught in the same building where I had been a student myself. At 16, in the year, my own teacher handed me a copy of a novel and told me I had the kind of mind that needed to be used. I never forgot that. The weight of that moment, the way a single sentence from the right person at the right time can reroute everything. That was why I became a teacher. Not for any grand reason. Just because I remembered what it felt like to be seen clearly by someone who didn't have to bother. I was strict in the classroom. My students knew it. No late work without a real explanation. No careless reading. No pretending you understood something when you didn't. I could always tell. The way you can always tell when a student is performing comprehension rather than actually feeling it. I didn't punish dishonesty harshly, but I named it plainly, which some of them found worse. What they didn't always see was that after class, I kept a record of every student I worried about, a small notebook, green cover, nothing official, just names and dates, and brief notes. Struggles to concentrate, family situation may be difficult, improved last week, notice and say something tomorrow. Bright, but hiding it, why? 30 years of those notebooks. In a box in the back of my closet. I have never thrown them out. Min used to tease me about it, said I was keeping evidence. I told him I was keeping track. He understood. He kept his own kind of records. Engineering logs, project files, careful documentation of every decision and its reasoning. When he retired, he didn't throw those away either. We were the same that way, both of us people who believed that details mattered, that the written thing outlasted the spoken thing, that a document is a form of memory that doesn't fade the way human memory does. That belief was why he had prepared the trust. We had talked about it seriously after his first health scare, a blood pressure episode that turned out to be manageable, but that shook us both into the kind of conversation couples sometimes avoid for too long. What happens after? What we owe the children and what we don't. What we want to protect. The grandchildren were young then. Thomas had married Vivian 2 years before, a quick courtship that I had watched carefully and said little about. Kevin was still unmarried, living in another city, calling every Sunday at noon without fail. The money was not a large sum by any standard, but it was Min's careful saving over a lifetime, money set aside from every year, from overtime and small sacrifices, and the kind of patient discipline that is easy to respect and hard to practice. He wanted it protected, not managed, protected. Attorney Holt had drawn up the documents. Min had read every page himself, slowly, with a pencil, asking questions about each clause. He had made me read it too. We had both signed, and then he had placed the originals in the rosewood box beneath the altar, in the envelope with his handwriting on the outside, and told me, "This is not for us to touch. This is for them, later, when they need it and we are not here." I had nodded. I had understood. What I had not fully understood yet, what I would only come to understand slowly, across many quiet evenings and carefully watched silences, was that Min had placed it there not just to protect the money, but to protect me. He had known, in the way he knew most things, that the time might come when I would need something solid to hold. Something that could not be reworded or reframed or smiled away. The rosewood box had sat beneath the altar for 4 years since he died. I had not moved it. But lately, when I lit the incense in the evenings, I had begun to notice something, a small wrongness I couldn't yet name, the way a teacher sometimes senses a student is struggling before any proof appears, just a feeling in the room, a stillness that was not peace, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. The first time Diana came to my house alone, she brought fruit, a basket of dragon fruit and rambutan, wrapped in cellophane with a ribbon, the kind of thing you buy at the market when you want to look like you came with good intentions. She set it on the kitchen counter and smiled at me, a different smile than Vivian's, less practiced, more eager, like a student who has just memorized the right answer but isn't sure of the material beneath it. "I was in the neighborhood," she said. Diana was never simply in the neighborhood. She lived 40 minutes away in a newer part of the city where the buildings were tall and the streets didn't have trees yet. She had never come to my house without Vivian before. I noticed this the way I noticed everything, quietly, without remarking on it, filling it away in the back of my mind the way I used to file away the small inconsistencies in a student's work. I made tea. I set out 2 cups. I asked about her business. She talked for a long time about a new investment opportunity, something to do with real estate pooling and managed accounts, the kind of language that sounds precise until you try to write down exactly what was said and find that none of the words actually meant anything specific. She used the phrase optimized returns 3 times. She said low exposure, high yield twice. She said Vivian had already looked into it thoroughly and thought it was very sound. I poured more tea. I asked her which firm she worked with. She named a company I had never heard of, said it was newer, boutique, very selective about clients. She said the trust accounts, she said it casually, the trust accounts, as though this were a topic we had discussed many times before, would benefit from being moved under a consolidated management structure. Less paperwork for me. Better growth for the grandchildren. I looked at her over the rim of my cup. Min set up those accounts with Attorney Holt, I said. Any changes would need to go through him. Something moved across her face, just briefly. Then she smiled again. Of course. We just wanted to make sure you were informed. Grandma Hazel, Thomas thought you might have questions and feel more comfortable hearing it from family first. I did not say that Thomas had not called me in 11 days. I did not say that I had counted. After she left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time. The dragon fruit sat on the counter in its cellophane wrap, still ribboned, untouched. The afternoon light came in low through the window above the sink, catching the dust in the air, and the house was very quiet. I went to the main room. I lit one stick of incense at the altar, stood the way Min used to stand, not praying exactly, just present, just reporting in. The smoke rose in a thin line and then curved slightly in the draft from the window, the way it always did. I thought about the phrase she had used. The trust accounts. Not times your husband's trust times, or times the fund for the grandchildren. Just times the trust accounts, like a line item, like something administrative. Min had never spoken about it that way. To him, it was never an account. It was a promise. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from a financial management company. It was addressed to me, formally, on heavy letterhead. It thanked me for my interest in their consolidated portfolio services and outlined the terms of a management agreement. At the bottom, in the signature line, my name was typed. Below my typed name, there was a signature. I read it 3 times. I had never contacted this company. I had never expressed interest in any consolidated portfolio service. I had never signed anything. I sat down at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me. I read it again. The signature was not mine. I could see that immediately. 30 years of marking student work had made me precise about handwriting, about the particular way a person forms their letters, the pressure they use, the angle of their hand. My signature is small and even, with a slight leftward tilt from decades of writing comments in the margins of papers. The signature on this letter was larger, rounder, the H in Hazel looping in a way mine never does. It was a reasonable forgery. Someone who didn't know my handwriting well might not have noticed. I set the letter down very carefully. The way you set down something fragile. I went to my bedroom closet, to the shelf where I kept my old teaching notebooks, the green-covered ones, 30 years of them, every student I had ever worried about. Behind them, in a flat tin I had never thrown away, were cards and letters I had saved over the years. Report cards signed when the boys were young, a note from Min's mother, birthday cards I had written myself, and then kept copies of, not out of vanity but out of habit, the same habit that made me keep records of everything. I found a card I had signed 15 years ago, my name clear in my own hand, the small, even letters, the slight leftward tilt. I put it next to the letter from the financial company. I looked at both signatures for a long time. Then I went to the rosewood box beneath the altar. I had not opened it since the evening a few months ago, when I had stood there in the low incense light and felt that nameless wrongness begin to gather in the room. Now I lifted the lid, removed the brown envelope, and checked that the original trust documents were still inside. They were. Min's handwriting on the outside. The rubber band still in place. I held the envelope and breathed slowly. I did not call Thomas. Not yet. I had learned long ago, in 30 years of teaching difficult conversations, that there is a difference between reacting and responding, and that the gap between them is where the truth lives. A reaction closes things down. A response waits until you know what you are actually dealing with. I put the envelope back. I locked the box. I went to my desk, opened the small notebook I kept for household matters, appointments, expenses, things to remember, and on a clean page I wrote the date and 3 words. Letter. Wrong signature. Then I put the letter from the financial company in the drawer beneath my desk, under a stack of old utility records where no one would think to look. I did not sleep well that night. In the dark, I lay still and listened to the house settle around me, the small sounds of old wood and old walls, and I thought about my students over the years, the ones who had tried to submit work that wasn't theirs, who had thought that because I was quiet I was not watching. They had always been surprised when I knew. They had always asked how. I never explained. Some things you learn to see not because you were looking for them, but because you trained yourself never to stop looking at all. Something was being taken from me. I didn't know how much yet. But I knew the shape of it now, the careful, patient shape of a theft that had been planned to look like paperwork. And I knew that whoever was doing it had badly misjudged what kind of old woman I was. I have always been a woman who reads carefully before she signs anything. This was not a skill I was born with. It was something I learned the hard way, early in my teaching career, when I signed a form without reading it fully and discovered 3 months later that I had agreed to lead the school's annual cultural exhibition, a 2-month undertaking that consumed every weekend from October through December. Min had laughed, not unkindly. He said, "You of all people should know that the words matter more than the gesture of signing. I never made that mistake again. So when I decided to look more carefully at the trust, I did not rush. I waited 4 days after finding the forged letter. I went about my routine morning tea, the market on Tuesday, the phone call with Kevin on Sunday where I said nothing unusual, nothing that would signal anything had changed. I watered the potted gardenias on the balcony. I dusted the altar. I cooked simply and ate alone, and let the house be quiet around me. On the 5th day, I called Attorney Holt's office. Raymond Holt was a small, precise man in his late 60s who had handled Min's estate paperwork and had known us both for nearly 20 years. His office was downtown, on the 3rd floor of a building that still had wooden floors and ceiling fans. The kind of office that belonged to a man who had no interest in impressing anyone. I had always trusted him for that reason. He did not perform competence. He simply had it. His assistant told me he was in meetings until noon. I left my name and number. He called back at 12:15, exactly when he said he would. "Mrs. Nguyen," he said, "it's been a while. How are you keeping?" "I'm well, thank you," I said. "I have some questions about the trust, about the current account status." A pause, brief, but there. "Of course," he said. "Would you like to come in, or shall I pull the file and call you back?" "I'll come in," I said. "Tomorrow morning, if you have time." He had time. I dressed carefully the next morning. Dark navy blouse, the one I wore to parent-teacher conferences when I needed parents to take me seriously, hair pinned back. Min's watch on my left wrist, a small thing. But it steadied me. The weight of it familiar. Attorney Holt greeted me himself at the door to his office, which he had never done before when Min was alive. I understood that this was a form of respect, and I accepted it without comment. We sat. He brought the file. He set it on the desk between us and folded his hands and waited. I placed the letter from the financial management company on the desk. He looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he looked at me. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "It arrived at my house 2 weeks ago. My name is on it." "That is not my signature." He picked it up then, carefully, by the corner, and read it slowly. I watched his face the way I used to watch students during examinations, not looking for distress exactly, but for the quality of their stillness, what it revealed. What I saw in Raymond Holt's face was not surprise. It was something more careful than surprise. Something that told me he had, perhaps, been waiting for a reason to say something he had not yet found the right moment to say. He set the letter down. "Mrs. Nguyen," he said, "I need to show you something." He opened the file and removed a set of papers, not the original trust documents, but bank records, account summaries, transaction histories. He laid them out in order, each page overlapping the last, and I leaned forward and looked at what he was showing me. The trust account had been opened in 2009, the year Min had established it. The original principal was modest but carefully accumulated savings from 30 years of 2 civil servant salaries, set aside deliberately, added to each year in small amounts. By the time Min died, it had grown to a sum that was not a fortune but was, as he had intended, enough. Enough to give the grandchildren a foundation when they were old enough to need one. I looked at the balance from the year Min died. Then I looked at the balance from 12 months ago. The number had changed, significantly. I looked at Attorney Holt. "When did this happen?" "The first withdrawal was 18 months ago," he said. "A transfer authorization came through the bank signed by you and co-signed by a secondary trustee." He paused. The secondary trustee designation had been amended 6 months before that. "Amended," I said. "Added," he said carefully. 2 names were added as co-trustees with withdrawal authority. The amendment came through my office with what appeared to be your signature and a notary stamp. He stopped, set his hands flat on the desk. "Mrs. Nguyen, I have to tell you that when it came through, I had some concern. The timing seemed unusual, but the paperwork appeared complete. The notary was registered, and I had no legal basis to refuse it without your explicit instruction to the contrary." I looked at the names on the amendment. Vivian Nguyen, Diana Marsh. I did not say anything for a moment. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Somewhere outside the window, a motorbike passed in the street below. its engine small and distant. "How much is left?" I asked. He told me. I looked at the original balance. I looked at the current balance. I did the arithmetic in my head, the way I had always done arithmetic precisely, without softening the result. In 18 months, $260,000 had been withdrawn from an account that existed for one reason: to protect my grandchildren's future. I sat very still. "I want certified copies of everything," I said. "Every transaction record, every withdrawal authorization, the amendment document, the notary information, everything from the date the amendment was filed to today. I'll have them ready by this afternoon," he said. "Good." I picked up the forged letter from the desk, placed it back in my bag. "One more thing. Please do not contact Thomas about this visit or this request. Not yet." Holt looked at me steadily. "Understood." I stood. I straightened my blouse. I thanked him for his time with the same tone I had used for 30 years, when ending a difficult parent meeting, calm, conclusive, giving nothing away. He walked me to the door. On the way home, I sat in the back of a taxi and looked out the window at the city moving past, the afternoon light falling sideways through gaps between buildings, people going about their ordinary errands, fruit sellers and schoolchildren, and a man sleeping on a plastic chair outside a hardware shop. I thought about the notary stamp on the amendment. A registered notary meant a name, a license number, a verifiable record. It meant someone had sat in a room with whoever signed those papers and confirmed their identity. Either that person had been careless, or they had been paid to be careless, or something worse, they had been willing. Any one of those possibilities meant there was a trail. And when I got home, after I had set down my bag and stood for a moment at the altar with the incense burning low and Min's photograph watching from the frame, I went to my desk and opened the drawer where I kept the utility records and found that the forged letter was not the only thing in the drawer anymore. Underneath it, tucked flat against the wood, was a second envelope I had not put there. I had not opened my desk drawer since the day I filed the letter away. Someone had been in my house. I did not touch it immediately. That is the first thing I want to say. I stood at my desk with my bag still on my shoulder and my coat still on, and I looked at that envelope lying flat against the wood of the drawer, and I did not touch it. I breathed. I set my bag down on the chair beside the desk. I removed my coat and hung it on the hook behind the door. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and drank half of it standing at the sink, looking out the window at the neighbor's rooftop where a single potted bougainvillea had been blooming all month in a color so bright it looked almost aggressive against the gray sky. Then I went back to the desk. I sat down. I looked at the envelope again. It was plain white, unsealed, no writing on the outside, letter-sized. Thin, not much inside, perhaps 2 or 3 folded pages at most. I thought about who had been in my house. Thomas had a key. He had always had a key. From the time he moved out at 23, and I had pressed a copy into his hand and told him this house was always open to him. I had never asked for it back. It had not occurred to me that I would ever need to. Vivian, by extension, had access to that key. Diana had been here once alone, with her dragon fruit and her careful smile. I had not given her a key, but I had left her in the kitchen while I went to answer my phone in the bedroom. 10 minutes, perhaps. Long enough to make an impression of a key, if someone had thought that far ahead. I picked up the envelope. Inside were 3 pages, folded together. The first was a printed document, a summary sheet from the financial management company, the same one that had sent the forged letter. It listed an account number, an account holder name, my name, and a series of transaction dates and amounts. Beneath each amount was a notation, transfer authorized, co-trustee signature on file. The second page was a copy of what appeared to be a notarized authorization form, signed with my forged signature and stamped with the same notary seal I had seen on the trust amendment at Attorney Holt's office. The notary's name was printed clearly beneath the stamp. Quoc Nguyen, license number 847221, Sacramento, California. I stopped. Sacramento, California. I read that line again. The notary was registered not in this city, not in this country, but in Sacramento, an American city, a foreign jurisdiction, notarizing a document that was supposedly signed by a woman who had not left Vietnam in 4 years. I set the page down. My hands were steady. I have always had steady hands. Even in my first year of teaching, When I was 23 and terrified every morning before class, my hands stayed still when I wrote on the board. Min used to say it was the thing that made students trust me that I never showed my nervousness in my hands. I was grateful for it now. The third page was different from the others. It was not a financial document, it was a letter, handwritten, in Vietnamese, and the handwriting was Thomas's. I recognized it immediately. 30 years of reading student handwriting and 20 years of reading my son's grocery lists and birthday cards and short notes left on the kitchen counter. I knew every proportion of those letters, the way he pressed hard on downstrokes and went light on the curves, the particular way he made his vowels. I would not reproduce what it said here. Some things, once read, are best left without repetition, but the substance of it was this. Thomas had written to Vivian, and in the letter he had told her that he was afraid, that the amounts had gotten too large, that he was worried his mother would notice something was wrong, that he thought they should stop or at the very least, slow down before someone started asking questions. The letter was dated 8 months ago, which meant that 8 months ago, Thomas had known. He had known what Vivian and Diana were doing. He had been afraid of being caught, and he had not stopped it. He had not come to me. He had not called Attorney Holt. He had written his wife a private letter expressing his fear, and then, apparently, he had done exactly nothing. I sat at my desk for a long time. The incense on the altar in the next room had burned out while I was downtown. The house smelled faintly of the last of it, that particular dry, woody sweetness that never fully leaves a room, that has lived in the walls of this house for so long that I sometimes think it is part of the structure itself. I had always found it comforting. Sitting there with Thomas's letter in my hand, it felt different, like something that had been present during a moment I hadn't understood was important. I thought about the Sunday phone calls Kevin still made, faithfully, every week at noon. His voice easy and familiar, asking about the gardenias, about the neighbors, about whether I was eating properly. Kevin, who lived far away and came home twice a year and had no involvement in the trust, no co-trustee designation, no access to any of the accounts. Kevin, who did not know. I folded the 3 pages carefully and placed them back in the white envelope. I put the envelope in the same drawer, underneath the utility records, next to the forged letter from the financial company. I closed the drawer. I did not call Kevin, not yet, not until I understood the full shape of what I was holding, because there are some things you cannot unsay to a person you love, and a revelation made too early, before you have all the evidence in your hands, is just damage without direction. I went to the altar. I lit fresh incense, 2 sticks this time, which I almost never did, but the room needed it, or I needed the ritual of it, the small ceremony of striking the match and watching the smoke begin. I stood there and thought about Thomas at 7 years old, bringing home a mathematics exam with a perfect score, presenting it to me at the kitchen table with his chin lifted in that particular way he had, proud and a little defiant, waiting to see if I would make a fuss. I had not made a fuss. I had looked at the paper carefully, noted every problem, said, "Good, now show me how you solved this one," pointing to the hardest problem on the page. Because a right answer means nothing if you do not understand the working beneath it. He had groaned. He had sat down and showed me. He had understood the working. He had been genuinely good at it. That was the thing about Thomas that had always made his failures more painful than they would have been otherwise. He was not a foolish person. He knew better. He had always known better. The smoke from the incense rose and curved in the draft. I picked up my phone and looked at Attorney Holt's contact. I would call him first thing in the morning. I would ask him about the Sacramento notary, about the legal weight of a notarization issued in a foreign jurisdiction, about what constituted sufficient evidence to formally contest the trust amendment. But before I put the phone down, a message appeared on my screen. It was from a number I did not recognize. No name. Just a string of digits I had never seen before. And the message was 4 words. In English, which was strange enough on its own. Most people in my life messaged me in Vietnamese. The 4 words were, "Stop looking. Walk away." I stared at the screen. Then I took a photograph of the message, wrote the number down in my household notebook, and set the phone face down on the desk. Someone knew I had been to Attorney Holt's office, and that meant someone had been watching me long before I had started watching them. I did not respond to the message. I considered whether silence was the right move, whether a response might reveal more than it concealed, whether ignoring it entirely sent a message of its own. In the end, I decided that whoever had sent those 4 words was hoping for a reaction. Fear, complaints, the particular kind of paralysis that comes when someone realizes they have been seen. I was 68 years old, and I had spent 3 decades in rooms full of young people who thought that a raised voice or a threatening look could substitute for actual power. I had learned early that the most unsettling thing you can do to someone who wants to frighten you is to simply continue. So I continued. Monday morning I called Attorney Holt before 8. His assistant put me through directly this time, which told me he had flagged my name in whatever system he used to prioritize calls. The notary, I said, without preamble. Hazel Nguyen, Sacramento, California. Is that license number verifiable? I looked into it after you left, he said. The license is real. Hazel Nguyen is a registered notary in Sacramento County. But Mrs. Nguyen, a pause. A notarization performed by an American notary on a document that was supposedly signed in Vietnam has no legal standing under Vietnamese civil procedure. It wouldn't have been accepted by our local banking authority without additional authentication steps, but it was accepted, I said. Yes. His voice was careful, which means someone at the bank processed it without following proper verification protocol. Either through negligence, or they were helped, I said. Yes. I wrote the notary's license number in my notebook. Below it I wrote, bank contact who processed the amendment? Then I thanked Attorney Holt, told him I would be in touch, and hung up. I sat for a moment with the notebook open in front of me. 30 years of teaching had given me many things: patience, a high tolerance for confusion before clarity arrived, the ability to hold many pieces of incomplete information at once, without forcing them into a shape before they were ready. It had also given me a specific skill that I had never fully named until now. I knew how to build a case, not in the legal sense, not the way Attorney Holt built cases or the way investigators did, but in the quieter, more methodical sense of knowing how to gather evidence before anyone knows you are gathering it, how to ask questions that sound like conversation, how to file away the answer and ask the next question 3 days later, so that no single exchange reveals the direction you are moving. I had done this with students for 30 years. When I suspected cheating, I did not confront immediately. I collected. I noted. I waited until the pattern was undeniable, and then I acted from a position of complete certainty rather than suspicion. I would do the same now. There was a woman I had known for 20 years named Clara Phuong, who had retired from the city's land registration office the same year I retired from teaching. We had met through a neighborhood literacy program, and had remained friendly in the way that 2 private people remain friendly, not intimately, but with genuine respect. A shared habit of Tuesday morning walks along the lake road, and the comfortable silence of 2 women who did not need to fill every moment with words. Clara had spent 30 years in bureaucratic records. She knew how documents moved through official channels, how paperwork was processed and approved, where errors were made and where they were deliberately introduced. She was also, crucially, a woman who understood discretion. She had never once in 20 years told me anything she wasn't supposed to tell me, which meant I could trust her to understand when I needed the same. I called her that Tuesday and asked if she wanted to walk. We met at the usual place at 8 in the morning, the air still cool, the lake road quiet except for the occasional cyclist and a group of older men doing their exercises by the water. Clara wore her green jacket, the one she had worn every winter for as long as I had known her. We walked for a while without talking, which was normal. Then I told her what I needed. Not everything, not Thomas's letter, not the message on my phone, just the outline. A document had been processed through a bank that should not have been processed. I needed to understand what that process looked like from the inside. Who would have handled it? What a record of that handling would look like, and where it would be kept. Clara walked beside me and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The lake was gray that morning, slightly choppy, the far shore just visible through a light haze. A single white bird was standing at the water's edge, perfectly still, watching something beneath the surface. You need the transaction authorization records from the bank, she said. Not the account summary, the authorization chain. Every document that was reviewed when the amendment was processed. Every person who signed off on it internally. Every step from submission to approval. That's the record that shows whether proper protocol was followed. How do I get that? Attorney Holt can request it formally, as the original trust administrator. He has legal standing to demand a compliance audit of any transaction related to the trust. The bank has to provide it. She paused. But Hazel, if someone inside that bank was involved, the request will alert them. I know, I said. Is that a problem? I thought about the message on my phone. Stop looking. Walk away. Someone already knew I had been to Holt's office. The element of complete surprise was already gone. No, I said. Let them know I'm looking. I want them to know. Clara glanced at me sideways. She had the look she sometimes got during our walks, a particular kind of attention, as if she were recalibrating something. All right, she said. I have a former colleague at the banking authority. Retired now, but she still knows people. I can ask her, informally, about the notary authentication process for foreign jurisdiction documents. What the standard is and what it would look like if the standard wasn't met. I would appreciate that. We walked the rest of the loop without discussing it further. That was the right way to handle it, say what needed to be said, confirm the shape of the thing, and then let it rest. There is a patience required in the early stages of any serious undertaking that most people find uncomfortable. They want to move, to act, to feel the momentum of doing something. I had learned long ago that the deepest rivers are the ones that look stillest from the bank. Still water runs deepest, and it is the still water that carves through stone in the end, not the rushing kind that spends itself on noise. That afternoon, I went through the certified copies. Attorney Holt had prepared for me every transaction record, every withdrawal authorization, 18 months of systematic transfers, each one just under the threshold that would trigger additional review. I made a separate list in my notebook, dates, amounts, account numbers. I noted the pattern withdrawals clustered at the end of each month, spaced carefully, never two in the same week. Deliberate. Considered. The work of someone who had looked into how financial monitoring worked and arranged their theft accordingly. On the last page of the records, I found something I had not expected. One of the withdrawal authorizations dated 11 months ago had been co-signed not by Vivian, not by Diana, but by a third name I did not recognize. A man's name. Below the name was a professional title, Senior Accounts Officer, Trust and Estate Division. I looked at that name for a long time. Then I wrote it in my notebook, circled it twice, and understood that what I had thought was a scheme between two women and a weak-willed son was something larger, something that had required help from inside the institution that was supposed to protect the trust in the first place. The theft had not been clumsy and opportunistic. It had been engineered. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, slipped under my front door, sometime in the early morning, while I was still in the kitchen with my tea. It was printed on heavy cream paper, the kind that costs more than it needs to, with a small embossed logo at the top, Light of Gia Family Wealth Management, the name of Diana's firm, which I had now confirmed was registered in Singapore under a holding company with a Vietnamese nominee director and no verifiable physical address. Beneath the logo, in clean sans serif font, it read, Family Meeting Estate and Trust Review. This Saturday, 10:00 a.m. Please bring any questions about the transition of the Nguyen Family Trust. The transition. As though it had already happened. As though the word itself were a settled fact, a door that had already closed. I read it twice, standing in my hallway in my house slippers, the morning light coming in thin and sideways from the window above the stairs. Then I set it on the kitchen table next to my tea and sat down and finished my breakfast. They had called a meeting. That was interesting. It meant they had made a decision, reached a threshold of confidence, and were now moving to the consolidation phase, the moment in any scheme when the architects believe the hard work is done and all that remains is paperwork and performance. I had seen this pattern in students who cheated and thought they had gotten away with it. A loosening, an ease, a willingness to stop being careful because they believed the danger had passed. The dangerous time for them was right now. Thomas called that afternoon. His voice was different from his usual careful, managed tone, lighter, almost relieved, the way a person sounds when they believe they are delivering good news. Mom, did you get the invitation? I did, I said. Good. Vivian and Diana have been working really hard on the new structure. They want to walk you through everything, the accounts, the management plan, the the projections for the grandchildren's allocation, make it all clear and official. He paused. I think you'll be pleased with how organized it all is. I let a brief silence pass, just long enough to be considered. I'm sure it's very organized, I said. Diana's good at this stuff, Mom? She really knows the financial side. And it's all properly documented, notarized, everything. Another pause. A smaller one, with a different quality. It'll be good to have everything settled. He needed it to be settled. I could hear that in his voice, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and wants desperately to set it down. He had written that letter 8 months ago, afraid, and instead of acting on his fear, he had buried it, and the weight of that burial had been pressing on him every day since. He wanted Saturday's meeting to be the moment the pressure lifted. I almost felt sorry for him. I'll be there, I said. On Saturday morning, I dressed again in the navy blouse. Min's watch, hair pinned. I arrived at the address Diana's office, a rented suite in a glass-fronted building downtown, the kind of space that looks expensive but is arranged specifically to look more expensive than it is at exactly 10 o'clock. Vivian was already there, standing near the window in a cream blazer that matched the color of the invitation paper, which I suspected was not accidental. Diana sat at the head of the conference table, a laptop open in front of her, several folders arranged with precise symmetry. Thomas was in the corner chair, slightly apart from the women, in the way of a man who has chosen a position of technical presence and actual distance. There were 2 other people I didn't recognize, a young man with a tablet who was introduced as a documentation specialist, and an older woman who was introduced as a family liaison from the wealth management firm. Both of them smiled at me with the particular warmth of people who have been briefed to be kind to someone difficult. Grandma Hazel. Vivian crossed the room to take my hands, both of them, the way you greet an elderly relative at a funeral. Her grip was firm and her smile was wide, and her eyes were doing what they always did, moving, assessing, confirming that the room was arranged the way she intended. We're so glad you came. Come, sit here, right in the middle so you can see everything. She guided me to the chair at the center of the table, the seat of the guest, not the seat of the principal. I noted this and sat down without comment. Diana opened the meeting. She spoke for 20 minutes, fluent and polished, using a presentation on the laptop that showed charts and allocation models and projected returns. She used phrases like times fiduciary responsibility times, and times intergenerational wealth preservation times, and times optimized tax efficiency, and she used them with the smooth confidence of someone who has practiced the vocabulary long enough that it sounds native, even when the foundation beneath it is hollow. At several points she referenced documents on the table, the trust amendment, the management agreement, the new account structures, and each time she glanced at me with the particular expression of someone checking whether the audience was following. I kept my face attentive and mild. I asked 1 or 2 simple questions, the kind that sounded like genuine clarification. She answered them easily, which I expected she had prepared for a confused old woman, not a careful one, and those are very different audiences. Vivian watched me throughout with the watchfulness of someone who cannot entirely suppress their suspicion but has decided that suspicion is no longer necessary. At one point, when Diana was describing the withdrawal history framed, naturally, as a series of times initial management fees and administrative costs times Vivian's gaze moved to my hands, checking, I realized, whether I was taking notes. I was not. My notebook was in my bag, closed. I had memorized what I needed. Near the end of the meeting, Diana slid a single page across the table toward me. Clean white paper, a few paragraphs of dense text, a signature line at the bottom with my name typed beneath it. This is just an acknowledgement, she said, in the gentle voice one uses with someone who is being managed rather than consulted, that you've been informed of the trust transition and are in agreement with the current management structure. Standard practice. I looked at the page. I picked it up. I read it slowly, all the way through, every line, every clause, the way Min had read every document that had ever been placed in front of him, with a pencil, asking questions. I had no pencil today. I read it with my eyes, and with 30 years of training myself to see what text was actually saying beneath what it appeared to be saying. It was not an acknowledgement. It was a waiver. a relinquishment of any claim to challenge the trust amendment, the withdrawal history, or the current management structure. Signed, it would have closed every legal avenue Attorney Holt had already begun preparing. The room was quiet. Vivian's expression had settled into the particular arrangement of patient condescension she wore when she was waiting for me to comply with something she considered inevitable. Thomas was looking at the wall. I set the page back on the table. "I'll need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything," I said. My voice was even, warm, completely ordinary. The voice I used when I was giving a student one final chance to correct themselves before I acted. Something shifted in Vivian's face. Small, but present. "Of course," she said after a pause. "Take all the time you need." She was not concerned. I could see that in the way she leaned back slightly, the tension in her shoulders releasing. She thought I was buying time out of discomfort, that I would take the page home, look at it, perhaps call Thomas with vague questions, and eventually sign it because old women who don't understand money eventually defer to people who tell them they do. She had no idea that Attorney Holt's formal request for the transaction authorization records had been submitted to the bank 3 days ago. She had no idea that Clara's contact at the banking authority had already identified an irregularity in the notary authentication chain and was preparing a written finding. She had no idea that the senior accounts officer whose name appeared on the withdrawal authorization had resigned from the bank 6 weeks ago and was, according to a quiet inquiry Clara had made, currently under separate review for unrelated compliance issues. I folded the waiver page in half, placed it in my bag, and thanked Diana for the presentation. Walking to the elevator afterward, I heard Vivian behind me, her voice low, speaking to Thomas in the way she always spoke to him when she thought no one important was listening. "She'll sign it. She doesn't understand what she's looking at." The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. I thought, "No, Vivian, that is exactly where you are wrong." But I kept that thought where I kept everything that mattered still, quiet, completely below the surface, and I let the doors close between us without a word. Attorney Holt called me on a Thursday morning just after 9. I was in the garden at the back of the house, deadheading the gardenias the way I did every few days at this time of year, pinching off the spent blooms so the plant would put its energy into what was still living. It is a small, repetitive task, and I had always found it clarifying, the kind of work that keeps your hands occupied and leaves your mind completely free. I heard my phone from the kitchen windowsill and went inside. "Mrs. Nguyen." His voice was different from any other time he had called me. Quieter, more careful. The voice of a man who has something in front of him that he wishes were not there. "The bank responded to our formal request this morning. I have the transaction authorization records." "I'll come this afternoon," I said. "Yes," he said. "Please do." He met me at the door again. His assistant was not at her desk. I noticed that. The deliberate privacy of it. The office arranged so that whatever was about to happen would happen between just the two of us. The file on his desk was thicker than before. He had organized it with the precision of someone who had spent the morning deciding how to present something painful in the clearest possible order. He did not make me wait. "The transaction authorization records show 3 people who reviewed and approved the trust amendment when it was submitted to the bank," he said. "The first was the senior accounts officer. I mentioned the one who has since resigned. The second was a branch compliance officer who signed off on the notary authentication without completing the required cross-jurisdictional verification. Both of those failures are serious, and the banking authority's preliminary finding confirms it." He paused. "The third," he said, "was a co-authorization, not a bank employee. A co-trustee confirmation, submitted digitally, from an account registered in your son Thomas's name." I sat very still. The ceiling fan moved slowly overhead. Somewhere outside, a car passed in the street, and then it was quiet. "Thomas confirmed the amendment," I said. "Digitally. Using a secure banking portal linked to his personal email address. The timestamp shows he confirmed it at 11:47 in the evening. On a date 14 months ago." Holt turned a page. "The same date, Mrs. Nguyen, that Vivian and Diana submitted the original amendment documents to the bank. The same date. Not days later, not after reviewing anything. The same evening the paperwork was filed, at 11:47 at night. Thomas had sat somewhere, his bedroom, perhaps, Vivian beside him, or in the next room, and confirmed the amendment that stripped the original trust of its protections and handed withdrawal authority to his wife and her sister. He had not been coerced into it after the fact. He had not discovered it later, and said nothing. He had been there at the beginning, in the dark, pressing a confirmation button on a screen, authorizing everything. I looked at Holt's desk, at the papers, at my own hands resting on my knees, steady, the way they always were. "The letter I found in my desk drawer," I said. "The one in Thomas's handwriting, where he said the amounts had gotten too large and he was afraid." "Yes. He wrote that 8 months ago. 6 months after he confirmed the amendment." "Yes." So, the sequence was complete now. Thomas had helped them set it up. Then, 6 months in, as the withdrawals accumulated and the amounts grew larger than he had perhaps imagined they would, he had gotten frightened. He had written Vivian a private letter expressing his fear. And then he had done nothing, not reversed anything, not contacted me, not called Holt. Just written the letter and buried his fear and continued. 14 months of this. From the night he pressed the confirmation button to the Saturday morning meeting, where he sat in the corner chair and looked at the wall while his wife and her sister asked me to sign away my right to challenge any of it. I understood, sitting in that office with the fan turning overhead, that I had been wrong about one thing. I had known for weeks that Thomas was involved, that he had known. But I had held on to a version of his involvement that was slightly more forgivable than the truth I had told myself he was weak. That he had been manipulated, that perhaps Vivian had framed it to him as something routine, and he had trusted her judgment without understanding the full picture. The timestamp at 11:47 destroyed that version. He had known what he was confirming. He had done it anyway. And then he had lived in my house for Sunday lunches, and called me every few weeks and said times "I love you." Mom times in the voice of a man who needed to hear himself say it as though the saying of it could cover over the thing he had done in the dark. I thought about Min. About the evening he had placed the trust documents in the rosewood box and said, "For the grandchildren, when they need it and we are not here." He had trusted Thomas with that. He had believed I had believed that the instinct to protect his own children would be stronger than any other pull. We had been wrong. Something moved through my chest then, slow and heavy, not the sharp, quick feeling of anger but something deeper and quieter, the kind of grief that does not announce itself but simply settles, the way cold settles into a room when the heat goes out in the night. I had lost my husband. I had spent 4 years learning to live in a house that held his absence like a shape in the air, learning to set 1 cup instead of 2, learning to sit at the altar alone in the evenings. I had done all of that. I had not been prepared for this particular loss. The loss of the person I thought my son was. Holt was quiet, giving me the silence, understanding what it was for. After a moment I said, "Is there anything in the records that connects the bank employee, the senior accounts officer, to Vivian or Diana directly?" He turned to the last section of the file. The banking authority's review found a series of transfers from one of Diana's firm accounts to a personal account registered to a family member of the senior accounts officer. 11 transfers over 9 months, each for $4,000. $44,000. Paid to a family member's account, cleanly and regularly, in amounts small enough to avoid automated flagging. Diana had not just found a careless bank employee. She had purchased one. I looked at the page Holt placed in front of me, the transfer records, the account numbers, the dates, clean and undeniable, the kind of evidence that does not require interpretation. It simply is what it is. You look at it and it tells you exactly what happened. "How complete is this?" I asked. "Complete enough," he said, "for a formal complaint to the state banking authority, a civil claim to void the trust amendment on grounds of fraud and procedural violation, and a referral to law enforcement for the bank employee's conduct." He paused. "And, Mrs. Nguyen, complete enough that if Thomas is named in the authorization chain, which he will be, because his confirmation is in the records, he cannot claim ignorance." I folded my hands. "Then we file," I said. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. The fan turned overhead. Outside, the city went about its ordinary Thursday. But inside, in the part of me that had no audience and no performance, I was sitting in the kitchen of a house that no longer felt entirely like mine, across a table that Min had sanded smooth with his own hands, and I was understanding for the first time what it costs to be a person who does not look away. It costs you the story you told yourself about your family, and once that story is gone, There is nothing left to do but deal with what is actually there. I picked up my bag. I thanked Attorney Holt. I walked out into the afternoon light and stood on the pavement outside his building for a moment, the city moving around me, and I breathed, just breathed, in and then out, until I was ready to keep going. Then I kept going. I have always believed that preparation is a form of respect, not just respect for the task, but respect for the truth of it and acknowledgement that what you are about to do matters enough to be done properly. In 31 years of teaching, I prepared every lesson with the same care regardless of whether it was a class I had taught 20 times before or a new text I was approaching for the first time. My students sometimes asked if I ever got tired of it. All that preparation, all that organization before anything had even begun. I told them that preparation was not the work before the work. Preparation was the first form of the work itself. I spent the week after Attorney Holt's phone call preparing, not visibly, not in any way that could be observed or reported back. I kept my routine morning tea, the market on Tuesday, the gardenia bed in the afternoon, Kevin's Sunday call at noon. I responded to Thomas's midweek text with a short, ordinary message about the weather and a question about his younger son's soccer schedule. I did not call Vivian. I did not call Diana. I let the Saturday meeting recede into apparent silence the way a stone dropped in water eventually stops making rings on the surface while continuing to sink. But in the evenings, after the incense had burned down and the house settled into its night quiet, I worked. The first thing I organized was the evidence itself. Attorney Holt had given me certified copies of everything: the transaction authorization records, the banking authority's preliminary finding, the transfer records linking Diana's firm to the resigned accounts officer's family member, the original trust documents with Min's handwriting on the envelope. I had the forged letter from the financial management company. I had the anonymous message photographed from my phone. I had the copy of Thomas's handwritten letter, found in my desk drawer by hands that had not been mine. I arranged these in order on my kitchen table one evening and looked at them the way I used to look at a completed gradebook at the end of a semester, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes when scattered things finally resolve into a coherent shape. Each document was a sentence. Together, they were a paragraph. And the paragraph said something unambiguous. I bought a set of clear document sleeves from the stationery shop near the market, the good ones, the kind archivists use, acid-free, sealed at the top. I placed each document in its own sleeve. I numbered them in the upper right corner with a permanent marker, small and neat, the way I used to number exhibit pages in the teaching materials I prepared for examination review. I made a cover sheet listing every item by number with a one-line description of what it was and where it had come from. Then I made 2 complete copies. One set I placed in the rosewood box beneath the altar, beside Min's original trust envelope. One set I gave to Attorney Holt to hold in his office files. The original set I kept in a flat document folder in the drawer beneath my desk, the same drawer where I had found the envelope that was not mine. Let them come back to that drawer if they chose. Let them find organized evidence instead of scattered suspicion. That thought gave me a small, quiet satisfaction that I allowed myself to feel for exactly one moment before setting it aside. The second thing I did was call Kevin. Not on Sunday at noon, I called him on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual enough that he answered on the first ring with a slight edge of concern in his voice. "Mom, is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I need to talk to you about something important." "Not on the phone. Can you come home this weekend?" A pause. I could hear him recalibrating, setting aside whatever he had been doing. Kevin had always been the son who paid attention to register. He heard the thing beneath the thing, the way some students do, not all of them, just the ones who have learned to listen to more than the words. "Saturday morning," he said. "I'll take the early train." "Good, don't tell Thomas you're coming." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom," he said quietly. "How long has this been going on?" "I'll tell you everything when you're here," I said. He came on Saturday, as he promised. I met him at the door, and he looked at me the way he always— Kevin had never been good at pretending not to feel what he felt. It was sometimes inconvenient and always, I thought, a sign of integrity. I sat him at the kitchen table and I went through everything. Not quickly, not summarized properly. The way you present something that deserves to be understood fully. I showed him the documents in their numbered sleeves. I showed him the cover sheet. I showed him Attorney Holt's findings and the banking authority's preliminary report and the transfer records and Thomas's letter and the forged signature placed next to my real one for comparison. He did not interrupt. He read each document when I placed it in front of him, slowly, all the way through. His face was very still. When he got to Thomas's handwritten letter, he stopped for longer than he had stopped for anything else, and I watched him and said nothing. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at me. "What do you need from me?" he said. This was why I had called Kevin rather than handling it alone. Not because I could not manage it alone, I could, and had been, but because what was coming required a witness. Someone who loved the family and could not be accused of malice. Someone whose presence at the moment of resolution would make clear that this was not one old woman's grievance but a family's reckoning. "I need you to be in the room when it happens," I said. "That's all. Just be there." He nodded. No more questions. He trusted me to have prepared correctly. And I had. On Monday, I called Attorney Holt and told him we were ready to move to the next step. He had already drafted the formal complaint to the state banking authority and the petition to void the trust amendment. He had also, at my request, prepared a letter to be sent simultaneously to Vivian, Diana, and Thomas, formal, legal, precise, notifying them that the trust was under dispute and that no further withdrawals could be legally authorized pending resolution. "When do you want to send it?" he asked. "Friday," I said. "Send everything on Friday." The complaint, the petition, and the letter. Any particular reason for Friday? I thought about Vivian's voice in the elevator corridor, low and certain. "She doesn't understand what she's looking at." "Because they'll spend the weekend knowing," I said, "and not being able to do anything about it." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, with the restrained tone of a man who had been in law for 40 years and knew better than to celebrate before a case was resolved. "Understood. Friday it is." After we hung up, I stood at the altar for a while. The gardenias from the back garden were in a small vase on the altar shelf. Now I had started putting fresh ones there every week, something I had not done before. The white of them was very clean against the dark wood. I lit the incense. I stood the way Min used to stand. The week stretched ahead of me, 4 days of ordinary routine concealing something that was no longer building but had already been built, fully prepared, numbered, documented, witnessed, and ready. Friday was coming, and when it arrived, everything that had been moving quietly beneath the surface of this family for 14 months would finally, irrevocably, break into the open. Attorney Holt had suggested a neutral location. I had chosen my own house instead. This was deliberate. The house was mine, built by my husband's hands and my own decades of care. Paid for through 31 years of early mornings and red pen evenings and parent meetings that ran long into the afternoon. Every surface in it held the weight of something real. If the truth was going to be spoken in a room, it would be spoken in a room that knew the difference between what was real and what was performed. I had asked Holt to send the letters on Friday, as planned. By Saturday morning, all 3 of them had called Thomas first, his voice barely controlled, asking what was happening. Then Diana, clipped and precise, using the word times misunderstanding, times 4 times in 6 sentences. Then Vivian last, who did not ask questions but simply said, in a voice stripped of its usual performance, that she needed to speak with me. I told each of them to come to the house on Sunday at 10 o'clock. I told each of them separately. I did not tell any of them the others would be there. Kevin arrived Saturday evening and slept in his old room. In the morning, he made coffee while I arranged the kitchen table, and we did not speak much, which was right. There was nothing left to plan. Everything had been prepared. What remained was simply the doing of it. Vivian arrived first, at 2 minutes to 10, which told me she was anxious. Vivian was usually precisely on time, not early, not late, always calibrated to arrive at the moment of maximum composure. 2 minutes early meant she had been sitting in her car outside, working herself back to the surface of calm she needed. She came in and saw Kevin at the kitchen counter and stopped. 1 second, no longer. Then she recovered. "Kevin, I didn't know you'd be here." "Mom called me," he said. "Coffee?" Diana arrived 3 minutes later. She saw Kevin, and then she saw the table, the document folder lying flat in the center of it, the numbered sleeves visible through the clear cover, and something moved across her face that she did not fully manage to conceal. A quick recalculation. The expression of someone who had walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and found the walls arranged differently than anticipated. Thomas came last. He looked as though he had not slept. He looked at me, then at Kevin, and then at the table, and he sat down without being asked, in the corner chair, the same position he had chosen in Diana's conference room, technically present, physically apart. I stood at the head of the table, my husband's table, sanded smooth by his own hands, and I looked at all three of them. "Thank you for coming," I said. My voice was the voice I used when returning examination results. Calm, clear, carrying no more emotion than the material required. I opened the document folder. I want to start with this. I placed the first document on the table, the original trust, still in Min's brown envelope, his handwriting visible on the outside. For the children. Do not move. I did not open it yet. I let it sit there, that familiar handwriting, in the middle of the table where everyone could see it. Vivian looked at it. Then looked at me. The trust was established in 2009, I said. The principal, at the time of my husband's death, was $340,000. It was structured with a single purpose: to provide for the grandchildren when they were of age. The original documents name me as sole trustee, with attorney Raymond Holt as administrator. No co-trustees, no secondary withdrawal authorization. Those are the terms my husband specified and signed. I placed the second document beside the first. The trust amendment, the one that had added Vivian and Diana as co-trustees with withdrawal authority. This amendment was filed 14 months ago. It carries my signature. I placed the third document beside it, the card from 15 years ago with my real signature. The comparison I had made on the night I first found the forged letter. That is also my signature. I let them look at both. The room was very quiet. Outside, the neighbor's bougainvillea was moving slightly in a morning breeze, its color vivid through the kitchen window, improbably bright. "They are not the same signature," I said. Diana said evenly. "Signatures change over time. Age, health. I taught for 31 years," I said. "I signed my name on examination papers, report cards, correspondence, parent communications, and official school documents every working day for 3 decades. I have 30 years of records." I placed the fourth document on the table, a page from one of my old teaching notebooks, my signature dated 8 years before the amendment, and again 2 years before, and again the year Min died. The tilt, the pressure, the proportion of my letters did not change. What changed was who was holding the pen. Diana stopped speaking. I placed the transaction authorization records next. The bank processed this amendment using a notarization issued in Sacramento, California. I have not left Vietnam in 4 years. The banking authority has since confirmed that the authentication chain was not completed to the standard required for a foreign jurisdiction notarization. I placed the banking authority's preliminary finding beside the records. They have also identified a series of transfers, 11 of them, each for $4,000 from a firm account held in Diana's company name to a personal account belonging to a family member of the senior accounts officer who approved the amendment. I said Diana's name the same way I said everything else. Without emphasis, without drama. Names in this context were not accusations. They were simply labels attached to facts. I placed the transfer records on the table. The silence in the room had a different quality now. It was not the silence of people waiting for something. It was the silence of people who have stopped waiting because the thing they were waiting to understand has become completely clear. Thomas had not moved. He was looking at the table, at the spread of numbered documents, and his face had the expression of a man watching something he had known was coming and had been unable to stop even though he had known. I placed one final document on the table. His letter. His handwriting, unmistakable. Dated 8 months ago, addressed to Vivian. He closed his eyes. Vivian looked at the letter, and then looked at me, and for one moment the practiced surface of her, the calibrated warmth, the managed composure was completely gone. What was underneath it was not rage and not fear, but something smaller and more honest than either. The expression of someone who has believed deeply and for a long time, that they were more capable than the people around them. That belief, in this moment, was meeting its correction. I thought of what she had said to me, at my own table, in my own dining room, in front of the food I had made and the China Min had chosen, and the children who had gone quiet because the temperature in the room had dropped without warning. "You're just an old woman who smells like incense and doesn't understand how money works anymore." I had said nothing then. I looked at her now across the table covered in numbered evidence and I said, quietly, "I spent 31 years teaching young people to read carefully before they signed anything, to look at what a document actually says, not what someone tells them it says, to check the working, not just the answer." I paused. I never stopped. She said nothing. "Attorney Holt is filing the formal petition to void the trust amendment today," I continued. "The banking authority complaint was filed on Friday. The evidence has been provided to all relevant parties. What happens next is no longer in my hands." Kevin was standing at the kitchen counter. He had not moved or spoken for the entire meeting. He did not need to. His presence in the room was its own kind of statement, a witness, a son, a member of this family who had not known and had not participated, and whose quiet, steady presence at my side said everything that did not need to be said in words. I closed the document folder. "I think you know the way out," I said. It was not unkind. It was not triumphant. It was simply the end of the lesson, the moment a teacher finishes presenting the material and waits for the understanding to settle. Some students receive it with grace. Some receive it with anger. Some sit very still in their chairs and look at the marks they have earned and say nothing at all, because there is nothing left to say. Vivian stood. Diana followed. Thomas remained in his chair for a moment longer, looking at nothing, and then he stood too, without speaking, and walked out of my kitchen and into the hallway and out the front door, which he closed behind him with precisely the amount of care you use with a door that belongs to someone else. I stood at my husband's table in the late morning light, the documents arranged in their numbered sleeves in front of me. The gardenia I had cut that morning in its small vase on the windowsill. And I breathed. In, then out. Then I picked up my phone and called Attorney Holt to tell him it was done. I did not watch them fall. That is something I want to be clear about. I had not built this case so that I could stand somewhere and observe the damage, the way you might slow a car to look at an accident on the road. I had built it because it needed to be built. Because the money belonged to the grandchildren and the lie needed a name, and the people who had arranged it with such confidence needed to discover that confidence had a floor beneath it, and that the floor was made of paper they had not read carefully enough. After Sunday morning, I went to my garden and worked for 2 hours, cutting back the jasmine that had overgrown the trellis along the back wall. Physical work, repetitive, demanding enough attention that the mind could not wander too far into territory where it would not be useful. Kevin helped for a while, the two of us working quietly side by side in the late morning sun. And then he made lunch. And we ate at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things, his work, the train ride, whether the magnolia in the front needed pruning. He did not ask me how I felt about what had happened in that room. He knew me well enough to know I would say what needed to be said when I was ready to say it. He left that evening. The week that followed was quiet in the way that follows the end of a long effort, not empty, but settled. Attorney Holt filed the petition on Monday. The banking authority complaint was already in process. The machinery of consequence, once properly engaged, does not require much tending. It simply moves. On Wednesday, Holt called with the first development. Diana had contacted him directly, not through her own attorney, but personally, which told me her attorney had either not yet been fully briefed or had advised her against it and she had not listened. She had offered, in Holt's careful phrasing, to make a full accounting of all withdrawals and arrange repayment in exchange for a private settlement that would not involve the banking authority or law enforcement. I listened to this without surprise. What was the accounting she offered? I asked. She confirmed $312,000 in withdrawals from the trust account over 14 months. She characterized them as management fees and administrative costs. $312,000, not the full $340,000, which meant either she was rounding down, or she was hoping I wouldn't notice the difference, or she had already moved some portion of the money somewhere that made it difficult to include in a clean accounting. What about the payments to the bank officer's family account? I asked. A pause. She did not include those. Of course she didn't. Those were the payments that crossed a different line, the line between civil fraud and something a banking authority would refer to law enforcement. Diana was trying to negotiate the piece she thought could be contained while leaving out the piece that could not. Tell her the banking authority complaint stands, I said. She's welcome to cooperate with their investigation. That will be taken into account in whatever follows. Holt's voice carried that same restrained quality it always had when he was pleased with a development, but considered it professionally inappropriate to say so. Understood. I'll convey that. The second development came 3 days later, and it did not come through Holt. Kevin called me on Saturday morning, not at the usual Sunday noon, which was now the second unusual call in 2 weeks, and which told me before he spoke that something had shifted. Mom, he said, Thomas called me last night. I waited. He wants to cooperate with Holt, fully. He said he's going to provide a complete account of everything he knew, and when he knew it, including his digital confirmation of the amendment and the conversations he had with Vivian in the months that followed. Kevin paused. He said Vivian told him yesterday that she's retaining her own attorneys separately from him. Different representation. I understood immediately what that meant. When two people who committed something together retain separate legal representation, they have stopped trusting each other with the shape of what comes next. Each attorney will advise their client to position themselves as favorably as possible, which means each client will, at some point, be advised to explain the other person's role in greater detail than their own. It is not dramatic. It is simply arithmetic. When two people are trying to occupy the same smallest space in a legal outcome, one of them will move first, and then the other will move faster, and the result is a collapse that the original architects of the scheme could not have engineered better themselves if they had planned it. Vivian had given Thomas that letter, had let him write it, and had kept it, or had not destroyed it, which amounted to the same thing. Either she had kept it as leverage, or she had underestimated him, or she had simply been careless about a piece of paper that seemed, at the time, like something only the two of them would ever see, and Thomas had found it in the desk drawer where the envelope had been left. I had not been certain, until this moment, whether Thomas had placed that envelope there deliberately as a kind of confession, a document left where he knew I would find it, by a man who could not bring himself to speak what he needed to say. I was more certain now. A person who was going to fully cooperate with an attorney and provide a complete account did not do so impulsively. They had been ready to do it for some time. They had been waiting for the moment when the cost of silence exceeded the cost of speaking. He had left that envelope for me to find. It was the most honest thing he had done in 14 months, and it had cost him something. I did not forgive him for it. Forgiveness was a different process entirely, one that moved at its own pace and could not be rushed, but I noted it, the way I had always noted the moment a student stopped pretending they hadn't understood and finally asked the real question. Tell him to call Holt directly, I said to Kevin. Today, before anything else moves. I already did. I smiled just slightly, in my empty kitchen. By the end of that week, the picture had resolved into something clean and final. Diana, advised by her own attorney, had provided a full accounting to the banking authority, including the payments to the bank officer's family account, which she characterized as a professional consulting arrangement, a characterization the banking authority found insufficient. The former senior accounts officer, already under separate review, had been formally referred to law enforcement. Diana's firm account had been frozen pending investigation. Thomas's cooperation had filled in the remaining gaps in the authorization chain. His account confirmed what the documents had already shown, that he had pressed the confirmation button willingly on the same night the amendment was filed, and that he had known for most of the 14 months that followed what the money was being used for. His cooperation did not erase that. It simply placed it, accurately and completely, in the record. Vivian, advised by her own attorney, had said nothing. That silence was its own kind of statement. Vivian had spent 5 years in my life constructing a version of herself as a person who moved through rooms managing outcomes, who spoke first and most and loudest, who understood that language was currency and used it accordingly. The silence she was now keeping was not the peaceful kind. It was the silence of someone who had run out of the only resource they knew how to use. I thought about what she had said to me, at my own table, with my family around her and the food I had made growing cold. You're just an old woman who smells like incense and doesn't understand how money works anymore. She had been so certain of that. She had looked at me and seen a woman whose usefulness was over someone to be managed until the right papers were signed, after which she could be set aside like a piece of furniture that no longer fit the room being renovated. She had not seen the 31 years of careful watching. She had not seen the green-covered notebooks. She had not seen the rosewood box, or the man who built the table she sat at, or what it means to be a person who has spent an entire life understanding that the written thing outlasts everything else. She had smelled the incense and decided she knew what it meant. She had been wrong about almost everything. And now the documents, the real ones, the ones Min had placed carefully in their envelope with his own handwriting, were being reviewed by Attorney Holt's office in preparation for the formal restoration of the trust to its original terms. It was not finished yet. These things are never finished quickly. But the shape of the ending was clear, and it was the shape that Min had intended when he had built the trust in the first place: slow, solid, protected, arranged to outlast the people who might wish it otherwise. I went to the altar that evening and lit 2 sticks of incense. I stood there for a long time in the thin smoke, in the house that Min had built, and I let the quiet settle around me the way it always did in the evenings, familiar and still and entirely my own. Tomorrow there would be more calls, more documents, more of the careful procedural work that justice requires. But tonight the house was quiet, and the incense burned, and the gardenias on the altar shelf were still fresh, and that was enough. The letter from Attorney Holt arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was in the back garden when his assistant called to say it was ready for collection, the formal restoration order, signed by the presiding officer of the banking tribunal, confirming that the trust amendment had been voided in its entirety on grounds of fraudulent documentation and procedural violation. The original trust, in its original terms, had been reinstated. The account, now under proper administration with Holt's oversight, had been restored to the full principal through a combination of recovered funds and a settlement contribution negotiated from Diana's firm assets before the freeze was partially lifted. $340,000. The same number Min had left, not diminished, not redirected, returned. I thanked the assistant, hung up, and stood for a moment in the garden with my hands still carrying the small pruning shears I had been using on the jasmine. The morning was clear, the kind of early spring clarity that comes after a long season of gray, the air still cool but with something different in it, a lightness, the smell of wet soil and new growth beginning. I set the shears on the garden table. I went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink and made tea. I drove to Holt's office that afternoon and collected the letter and the restored trust documents, not copies this time, but the originals, the ones from the bank's own files, stamped and certified and dated. I placed them in a new envelope, plain white, and wrote on the outside in my own handwriting, "For the grandchildren, restored." I put that envelope in the rosewood box. It sat beside Min's original brown envelope, his handwriting next to mine, 2 layers of the same intention separated by years. I stood at the altar for a long time that evening. The incense burned the way it always did, that thin rising line that curves slightly in the draft, the smell of it so familiar now that I sometimes thought it was simply what the air in this house was made of. The accumulated presence of every evening I had stood here since Min died, every small accounting of the day, every quiet report to the photograph on the shelf. I looked at his face. The photograph from our wedding year, 26 years old and laughing. "It's done," I said, quietly, to the room, to him, to whatever version of him still lived in the particular quality of the silence this house held at evening. I did not cry. I had cried in private, a few times, over the weeks of this, not for the money, never for the money, but for Thomas, for the shape of what he had become and the shape of what he had chosen. That grief was not finished. It was simply honest now, sitting in its right place, neither larger nor smaller than it actually was. Thomas had been formally cautioned by the banking authority and had received a civil finding against him in connection with his digital authorization of the fraudulent amendment. He had cooperated fully, as he said he would. His cooperation had been noted. It had not absolved him, but it had placed him accurately in the record, a man who had made serious choices, had known they were wrong, had been afraid, had done nothing for too long, and had finally, at the cost of considerable damage, stopped. He had called me twice since the tribunal ruling. Both calls were short. He did not ask for forgiveness, which was the first truly wise thing he had done in a long time. He asked whether the trust had been fully restored. I told him yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he was glad, and that he was sorry, and that he knew those were not the same thing. I told him I knew that too. We had not repaired anything between us. Repair takes time and is made of actions more than words, and we were only at the beginning of it, in the place where you have cleared the rubble and can finally see the ground clearly, which is not the same as having built anything new, but the ground was there. That was something. Vivian I had not spoken to since the Sunday morning meeting. Her attorney had handled all subsequent communication. She had received the same civil finding as Thomas, with additional referral to the Financial Crimes Unit in connection with the payments to the bank officer's family. What followed from that referral was no longer my concern. It was in the hands of people whose job it was to concern themselves with exactly that. Diana I had not spoken to either. I had heard, through Clara, that the wealth management firm had been deregistered. That Diana had relocated. That her professional reputation in the networks she had cultivated with such care over the past several years had collapsed with a completeness that tended to follow public regulatory findings. I did not feel satisfaction about this. Exactly. What I felt was more like the absence of something, the lifting of a weight I had grown so accustomed to carrying that I had almost stopped noticing it. The particular exhaustion of being alert to a threat that no longer existed. In the third week of spring, Kevin came home again, this time for a full weekend, and we sat on the balcony in the late afternoon and drank tea, and watched the light change over the rooftops the way it does in this city at this time of year, going slowly from gold to amber to the pale gray blue of early evening. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the question he had not asked the first time he came, the one he had been patient enough to wait for the right moment for. I thought about it honestly. "I am," I said, "not unchanged, but all right." He nodded. He had his father's quality in that moment, the particular stillness of a person who knows that the right response to a true thing is simply to receive it without addition. We sat until the light was gone, and the first stars appeared above the building across the lane, faint and far away and very clear. I have thought, in the weeks since, about what this house has held. 30 years of a marriage that was not always easy and was always worth it. 2 sons grown from small frightened boys into men with their own complexities. A husband who built things with his hands and believed that the written thing outlasted everything else. A teacher who spent 3 decades in the same building, watching young people become more themselves, and who learned from that, watching that the most important things are almost never the loudest. The rosewood box sits beneath the altar. The trust is intact. The grandchildren will receive, when they are ready, what their grandfather set aside for them, not diminished, not redirected, not spent on things that had no right to it, restored to its original purpose, which was simply this: that the people who came after us would have something solid to stand on, built by people who cared enough to protect it. That is not a dramatic inheritance. It is not a story about wealth or victory or the performance of justice in front of a crowd. It is quieter than that. It is the story of a box under an altar and an old woman who knew where the key was kept. I light the incense every evening. I stand the way Min used to stand. And sometimes, in the particular quality of the smoke rising in the draft from the window, I think about what he used to say, what he said when I was anxious, when I was afraid, when I doubted whether the quiet way of doing things was equal to the loud world's demands. Still water runs deepest, Hazel. Let them think the river is calm. I let them think the river was calm. And while they watched the surface, the current moved underneath, steady and deep and patient, carrying everything that mattered safely to where it was always meant to go. To every mother and father who has been dismissed as too old, too slow, too out of touch to understand what's happening right in front of them, this story is for you. Quiet does not mean unaware. Patient does not mean powerless. The ones who built everything from nothing do not forget how to protect it. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about strength, dignity, and the kind of justice that arrives slowly but arrives completely. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you believe that staying silent and watching carefully is sometimes more powerful than speaking up, or does silence come at too high a cost?